Jair Bolsonaro, a former army captain with a history of saying things that caused arguments, became a powerful figure in Brazilian politics. He was very right-wing. His speeches often appealed to traditional values and reminded people of Brazil's time under military rule. In 2018, Bolsonaro took advantage of people's unhappiness with the government and won the presidential election. He promised to bring back order and traditional values. His win was a big change for Brazil, starting a period of right-wing populism. Bolsonaro's time as president was full of arguments and problems, many caused by his strong words and unusual way of governing. His supporters, who liked his tough image and promises to improve the economy, often ignored his more extreme statements. But people who didn't like him, both in Brazil and in other countries, saw him as a danger to democracy and human rights. Bolsonaro's military background and his admiration for Brazil's past dictatorship worried people about his belief in democracy. He often fought with opposition parties, the courts, and even people in his own cabinet. This made Brazilian society even more divided. Other countries watched Bolsonaro's presidency with worry. His policies about the environment, especially about the Amazon rainforest, were criticized by many. His friendships with other right-wing populist leaders like Donald Trump also made people raise their eyebrows. Bolsonaro's time as president left a big mark on Brazil, changing its politics for years to come. As COVID-19 spread around the world, Brazil faced a huge health crisis. Instead of listening to health experts and making strict rules to keep people safe, President Jair Bolsonaro said the virus wasn't a big deal, calling it a little flu. This dismissive attitude had terrible results, making the virus spread more and making it harder to stop. Bolsonaro's denial wasn't just talk, it led to real decisions that hurt public health. He criticized state governors who made lockdown rules, saying they were hurting the economy. Bolsonaro also told people not to wear masks or social distance, even though health organizations around the world said these things were important. Some people agreed with the president's views on the pandemic. They didn't think the virus was serious or didn't want the government telling them what to do. Bolsonaro's supporters often repeated his words, downplaying the virus and refusing to follow health rules. This made it hard for the government to handle the crisis. Bolsonaro's denial had a big impact on Brazil's ability to control the virus. The country became a center of the pandemic, with a huge number of sick and dead people. Hospitals were too full, and healthcare workers were overworked. The pandemic also hurt the economy, making existing problems worse. Jair Bolsonaro's response to COVID-19 wasn't just about denial. He also spread false information, especially about vaccines. While scientists worked hard to make safe and effective vaccines, Bolsonaro said they wouldn't work and made strange claims. One of the strangest things Bolsonaro said was that the COVID-19 vaccine could turn people into alligators. This silly statement made during a speech was laughed at and criticized by health experts in other countries. But some of Bolsonaro's supporters believed him, making even more people hesitant to get vaccinated in Brazil. Bolsonaro didn't just question vaccines, he told people not to get them, even when they were easy to get. He said they weren't safe or effective, even though scientists proved they were. His government also waited to buy and give out vaccines, making it harder to protect people. Bolsonaro's anti-vaccine words had bad results. Brazil, once a leader in vaccination, saw fewer people getting vaccinated, not just for COVID-19 but for other diseases too. This was a serious problem for public health, making people vulnerable to outbreaks. Jair Bolsonaro's denial of the pandemic and his false information about vaccines hurt Brazil's public health system. The country, once known for its good healthcare, struggled to handle the huge number of COVID-19 cases and deaths. Hospitals were overwhelmed without enough beds, ventilators, and supplies. Healthcare workers were under a lot of pressure. They worked very hard, often without enough staff or equipment to care for sick people. Many healthcare workers got sick themselves, and some sadly died. The pandemic showed the weaknesses in Brazil's healthcare system and how much it hurt the people who worked in it. Bolsonaro's mismanagement of the pandemic caused more than just a health crisis. The economy suffered as lockdowns and restrictions hurt businesses. The pandemic made existing inequalities worse, especially for poor communities. It also caused more political arguments and social unrest. Many people died because of Bolsonaro's policies. Brazil had one of the highest COVID-19 death tolls in the world. Each death was a story of sadness and suffering. Families were broken apart, and communities were devastated. The pandemic's impact, both physical and emotional, will affect Brazil for a long time. Section 5, Democracy Under Threat, Bolsonaro's attacks on institutions. Jair Bolsonaro's time as president wasn't just about his controversial handling of COVID-19, he also attacked Brazil's democratic institutions. From the beginning, Bolsonaro didn't respect democratic rules and tried to weaken the systems that keep democracy working. Bolsonaro's attacks on the courts were especially worrying. He often fought with the Supreme Court, criticizing its decisions and saying the judges weren't legitimate. Bolsonaro's supporters often agreed with him, saying the court was too powerful. This loss of trust in the judiciary worried people about the future of law and order in Brazil. Congress was also attacked by Bolsonaro. He often fought with lawmakers, especially those who disagreed with him. Bolsonaro tried to go around Congress sometimes, making rules that were later overturned by the courts. His attempts to weaken Congress were seen as a way to grab more power for himself. Bolsonaro's words and actions created a climate of fear, especially for journalists, activists, and politicians who criticized him. His supporters often harassed and threatened these people online. This shrinking space for free speech made people worry about Brazilian democracy. Section 6. The election and its aftermath. A divided nation. The 2022 Brazilian presidential election was very important. It was between President Jair Bolsonaro, the far-right leader who had divided the nation, and Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the left-wing former president returning after being in jail for crimes that were later thrown out by the Supreme Court. The election was about more than just Bolsonaro, it was about the future of Brazil. The campaign was very divisive. Bolsonaro continued to say inflammatory things, question the election process, and even suggest he might not accept the results if he lost. His supporters, many of whom saw him as a hero, worried about cheating and promised to defend him. Lula campaigned on unity, social justice, and fixing the economy. He wanted to bring people together after Bolsonaro's divisive words, promising to address inequality, protect the Amazon, and improve Brazil's image around the world. The election was very close, with Lula winning by a small margin. It showed how divided Brazil was. Lula's supporters celebrated, while Bolsonaro's supporters were upset, some saying the election was stolen. Section 7. The Legacy of Bolsonaro, a Fractured Democracy. Jair Bolsonaro's presidency changed Brazil significantly. His legacy is complicated, with strong supporters and strong critics. His time as president made existing social and political divisions worse, leaving a fractured democracy. One of the most important parts of Bolsonaro's legacy is the damage to democratic norms and institutions. His attacks on the courts, Congress, and the media, along with his attempts to undermine the election process, weaken the systems that protect democracy. This makes Brazil more vulnerable to authoritarianism and populism. Bolsonaro's presidency also saw more political arguments and social unrest. His divisive rhetoric, often filled with prejudice, fueled anger and distrust between different groups. This polarization made it harder to agree on anything and solve the country's problems. Another lasting consequence of Bolsonaro's rule is the environmental damage. His policies, especially about the Amazon rainforest, led to more deforestation. His government weakened environmental protections, allowed illegal logging and mining, and downplayed climate change. Section 8. International Repercussions. Bolsonaro's Impact on Global Stage. Jair Bolsonaro's presidency affected not just Brazil, but the whole world. His policies, words, and alliances impacted Brazil's image, hurting its relationships with other countries. Bolsonaro's environmental policies, especially about the Amazon rainforest, were criticized by world leaders, environmental groups, and people everywhere. The Amazon is important for the global climate, and its destruction has serious consequences. Bolsonaro's weakening of environmental protections and encouragement of deforestation caused international anger, leading to boycotts of Brazilian products and calls for sanctions. Bolsonaro's friendships with other right-wing populist leaders like Donald Trump worried people about his belief in democracy and human rights. His admiration for authoritarian governments and his dismissal of international cooperation further isolated Brazil. Bolsonaro's foreign policy, often isolationist and disregarding multilateralism, hurt Brazil's relationships with allies and trading partners. His government's withdrawal from international agreements and organizations, along with his confrontational diplomacy, reduced Brazil's influence. Section 9. A New Hope. Lula's Return and the Challenges Ahead. Luiz Inácio. Lula da Silva's win in the 2022 election gave hope to many Brazilians who were tired of Jair Bolsonaro's divisive rule. Lula, a popular leader, promised to fix the damage of the past 4 years, unite the country, and improve Brazil's image in the world. But he inherited a country with many problems caused by Bolsonaro. One of Lula's biggest challenges is fixing the deep political and social divisions in Brazil. Bolsonaro's presidency made existing problems worse, fueling polarization and anger. Lula needs to bring people together, encouraging conversation, tolerance, and forgiveness. The economy is another big challenge. Brazil is still recovering from COVID-19, with high unemployment, rising poverty, and slow growth. Lula's government needs good economic policies that create jobs and reduce inequality. Improving Brazil's image around the world is another priority. Bolsonaro's policies and words hurt Brazil's reputation, strained relationships with allies, and reduced its influence. Lula must rebuild trust with other countries, show Brazil's commitment to working together, and re-engage in global efforts to address climate change and poverty.